Metroid Zero Mission, a 2004 release for the Game Boy Advance handheld unit, and fun fact, the first time that a second Metroid game graced the same Nintendo system, beating out Metroid Prime 2 on GameCube by a few months. This is a remake of the original Metroid video game that graced the Nintendo Entertainment System and Family Computer Disk System back in 1986. To put it simply, you take the old Metroid game and you bring it up to Metroid Fusion standards with new audio-visual assets, new levels, new threats, new toys, and even some new canon or something. Basically, you're modernizing that game for the modern age of the time, the same way that Metroid 2 would eventually get remade and modernized for the modern age with the 3DS release of Metroid Samus Returns, which I did eventually get around to playing and it's okay. That's all I really got to say in that regards. Zero Mission, being a remake of the original Metroid, places you back on planet Zeeps.
I don't care what you call it, I call it Zeeps.
Where you have to kill the Mother Brain and prevent the space pirates from making use of the Metroids and their life-sucking powers. Or at least do a better job of it this time, or I don't know. So you have the familiar territories, the Brinstar, the Norfair, the two boss lairs, the Torian, where the Metroids and Mother Brain reside, and in a rather neat touch, a lot of these areas are laid out in an almost similar fashion to how they were laid out in the old game. So if you played the original Metroid and have any familiarity with that game, you'll have a slightly easier time being able to navigate your way around the planet. Of course, it's not all the same, this being a remake and all. Zero Mission gives you new terrain and new hazards to cover, and that means occasional trips to the surface realm of Crateria and the ancient ruins of Chizodia, which boasts many mysteries along with mysterious items that you will come across that will be incompatible with your current suit, because apparently the narrative has been changed so that somewhere along the way, Samus gets a new suit here. Okay, whatever, I'll go with it. Never mind the fact that they kinda already explained the shoulder bumps in Metroid 2. But whatever, it makes more sense than Samus suddenly being terrified of a boss monster that she has defeated countless times in the past and oh no, we're not going there. So much like in Fusion, Zero Mission sorta guides you along the way. Instead of a talkative nav computer giving you explicit instructions, you'll come across Chozo statues that will give you a general idea on where to go. But unlike in Fusion, some of these can be skipped entirely, and how you get to said location is entirely up to you and your current abilities, allowing for a little more open-endedness than Fusion offered. Though make no mistake, Zero Mission still has a designated path for you to follow, looking for items required to progress onwards, dealing with little side deals to open new paths, but in terms of the overall scope, there is more of an open-ended nature that merits exploration and even revisiting these locations when you have some better hardware on hand. And better hardware is the name of the game in Zero Mission. You have the usual accoutrements of the original Metroid, but added in are power-ups from later games. Speed boosts, charge beams, super missiles, combined beams, power grips, and whatnots. The added ornaments actually makes Zero Mission a bit of a breeze once you attain them, but the game does give you some new sub-bosses and segments to contend with, and to mix things up, there's a segment towards the end of the game where you're playing Samus without her suit. They call this Zero Suit Samus because she's a bit of a zero in this form, as her main blaster only stuns when charged and she takes more damage than usual, so this whole segment becomes more stealth-based where you're trying to avoid triggering alarms that will send a billion pirates after you. It's a nice change of pace, I suppose, and a way to implement that element from Fusion, but at the same time, it always felt like something that was added in just to pad out the game. There's also different modes that get unlocked over time as you beat the game. A time attack mode for the speedrunners, a hard mode that increases the difficulty, and as an added bonus, you'll unlock a fully playable version of the original Metroid as it appeared on the NES all those years ago. Like the NES release, you have passwords, though the game will remember the password for the next time you play if you so choose, so that's a nice touch. In terms of control, it remains unchanged from Fusion. You're holding the trigger to arm your missiles, which is something that takes a bit of getting used to if you haven't played Fusion, but it does work. Samus does have a bit more speed in the Zero mission. If anything, this game feels much faster than any that came before, almost to the point where Samus can be somewhat hard to come to grips with due to this extra speed. It's still workable and the control is relatively tight, but because everything seems quicker, Zero Mission feels like a substantially shorter game than it is, and it's already a fairly short game to begin with. Only a couple bosses, only a couple major segments. You probably beat this in a couple hours, more or less. The visual style of Metroid Zero Mission is somewhat of a mixed bag and not necessarily in a negative way. You have some basic looking character sprites and level bits in the foreground, overlaying these somewhat stylized backgrounds that look to have been taken from a graphic novel of sorts. Some of the cutscenes that play in the game, in fact, have somewhat of a motion comic book feel, which lends credence to this visual style. Now this is mostly evident with some caverns and such, but some backgrounds seem more like traditional looking backdrops and aren't quite as stylized, hence the mixed bag. It's a pretty slick looking game regardless, with some nice creature designs, whether it be new takes on old classics or just new classics, whatever that entails. This being a remake of the old Metroid game that graced the FDS and NES way back when, a lot of the soundtrack are remakes of the old 8-bit soundtrack that feels a bit more fleshed out and moody, somewhat atmospheric even. There are fine renditions of old tunes, there's a couple new tracks as well that aren't too bad, and some solidly solid sound effects, partly recycled from Fusion and partly generic sounds and growls and stuff. It's okay, it's fine, it works, whatever. Overall, Metroid Zero Mission is essentially Metroid Fusion under a different skin with a new set of levels to explore, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It does a fine enough job of reimagining the original Metroid while attempting its own thing, while at the same time adding some lore to that first chapter that fleshes things out a bit. As a Metroid title on its own merits, it's a more than serviceable follow-up to Fusion that sticks to the formula without really adding much to it. As a remake of the original 8-bit classic, it's a perfectly fine remake that I would recommend playing over the original since it makes more sense, I guess. But yeah, Metroid Zero Mission, this is fine. Just fine.